Good evening and welcome to the New York Public Library. Before we begin, could you please silence your devices? Thank you. I'm so happy to welcome you to our final Conversations from the Cullman Center of the season. Stephen Hahn will discuss his new book, Illiberal America, A History, with Linda Gordon. My name is Lauren Goldenberg. I am a deputy director of the Dorothy and Louis B. Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers. I am at this podium instead of the center's director, Salvatore Scibona, as he is unfortunately unable to be with us this evening. As you may already know, the Cullman Center selects 15 fellows a year to a 9-month term. Fellows receive an office in the center just next door, access to the library's unparalleled collections, and a stipend so they can focus on their work here during their fellowships. The fellows come from all over the world and from a wide range of writing backgrounds. The Cullman Center was founded in 1999, and we are in the midst of our 25th fellowship year. Tomorrow, should you want to return to the library as soon as possible, past Cullman Center fellow Ayanna Mathis will be in conversation with Marilyn Robinson as part of Live from NYPL. They will be discussing Reading Genesis. As for our series here at the Cullman Center, we will pick up again in September. Tonight, Steve and Linda will speak for about 35 to 40 minutes before we turn to questions from the audience. If you'd like to ask a question, please write it down on the index card on your seat, and a staff member will walk along the aisles towards the end of the conversation to collect all the cards. This event is being live streamed on YouTube. If you are joining us virtually and would like to ask a question, please either type it into the chat or email cullmancenter@nypl.org. This event is also being broadcast on C-SPAN. Copies of Illiberal America are available for sale right outside the doors. Steve has graciously agreed to sign copies after the talk, which he will do so outside in the hall. And now to introduce our speakers. Linda Gordon has taught at the University of Wisconsin and NYU. Originally a historian of Russia and Ukraine, she published Cossack Rebellions, Social Turmoil in the Ukraine. Turning then to U.S. history, her work focused on the history of gender and family issues, publishing books on the history of birth control, family violence, and welfare. Her book, The Great Arizona Orphan Abduction, won the Bancroft Prize for Best Book in American History and the Beveridge Prize for Best Book on the History of the Western Hemisphere. Her biography of photographer Dorothea Lange won a second Bancroft Prize, among other awards. Her most recent books are Feminism Unfinished, A Short, Surprising History of American Women's Movements, and The Second Coming of the KKK. A new book on 20th century American social movements will be out in the fall of 2024. She was a Cullman Center Fellow here in our early days back in 2004 and 2005. Stephen Hahn is a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian who studies American political and social movements. His acclaimed works include A Nation Under Our Feet, which was awarded the Bancroft Prize, the OAH Merle Curti Prize, and the Pulitzer Prize for History, and A Nation Without Borders, published in 2016. He teaches at New York University and lives in New York City and Southold on Long Island. In the New York Times, David Leonard wrote that Steve's book, quote, makes an important case for vigilance in the face of extremism and warns against telling the history of the United States as one of inevitable progress. And on that note, please join me in welcoming Steve and Linda.
Well, thank you, and particular thanks to the Cullman Center, not only for inviting me to do this, but for the year so long ago that I got to spend here. Even more, I want to thank Steve Hahn, because for one thing, this got me to read your book right away, and who knows when I would have got to it. But it actually had a big impact on me. And I want to start by asking you and other people to think about the title, because talking about using the term illiberal is not common in the way historians think about things. We have a lot of other labels, but it's very illuminating. And I do want to point out that it's not often that the very title of a book introduces you to a new way to think about history. So I want to pose to you a bunch of questions that hover around this term. How did you come to choose that term? How does it differ from other labels for conservatisms? And of course, is illiberalism the opposite of liberalism, which may seem evident, but to me, I think it's not totally evident. So I wonder if you could just talk a little about that.
Those are great questions. Let me just begin by thanking the Cullman Center, Salvatore Scabona, who unfortunately is not here, Lauren Goldenberg, who was generously introducing us, Paul Delaverdac, who is also, with Lauren, a deputy director, and the entire staff of the New York Public Library. As we were here in a weird year, it was 2020, 2021. We had very limited access to the resources of the library and limited access to each other. There was very little FaceTime, which was really unfortunate because we were on Zoom a lot and people presented their work on Zoom. And when you heard about the work, it was like, fabulous throughout. And yet we didn't really have much time to talk with each other. I did have the good fortune of getting to know a few people, but, between the Cullman Center staff and the other people in the library, they really put themselves at a lot of risk in order to help us. So I really, really appreciate that. And my fellow fellows who I did get to know a little bit and who, in a variety of ways, helped me think about what I was doing. Now, to your questions. The best way to start answering them is to talk a little bit about how this book came into being. In many ways, I've been writing about this subject for my entire life as a historian, but chiefly from the point of view of those who were on the receiving end of illiberalism and illiberal movements. Basically, what happened was in 2015-16, I was really struck by the reaction of journalists and other observers to the Trump campaign who talked about how he violated liberal democratic norms. I wasn't entirely sure what those norms were, but it was interesting that already by 2016, just looking at the Supreme Court, that the Supreme Court had intervened and determined the outcome of a presidential election, that in Citizens United had opened the spigot of big money, had gutted the Voting Rights Act, and state legislatures across the country were basically mimicking what was happening at the end of the 19th and early 20th century in restricting voting rights. I thought this was pretty obvious, but somehow there was this, interest, and I think there still is, in talking about how there are these liberal norms out there that somehow are strong and enduring, and you have a case where, as a noxious weed growing, out of the ground is sucking them up. So I decided I thought I would, maybe take a shot at writing about this. And then the question was, how would you conceptualize a project? Because I really wanted to do something of a deep history. And I had been reading about illiberalism, which again, apropos of Linda's question, is a relatively recent vintage. So then the question is, well, how can you use something that basically is coming out in the end of the 20th and beginning of the 21st century as a way of talking about this phenomenon historically? And I'm sure, I won't convince some readers of the use and wisdom of that. But what struck me about illiberalism, and I'll just, I will in a sec talk about what its aspects are, is that I found it a very capacious concept that could encompass a variety of forms of social organization, intellectual disposition, movements that may emerge, that sometimes overlap with conservatism, but not always. They weren't always conservative. And sometimes they took forms that we wouldn't necessarily see that way, but nonetheless, that's how things turned out. And it was also flexible, so I could think about change over time. I was really worried about telling a continuity story. This gets embedded, and that's the way it is, and it plays out again and again and again. And what I was its features, which have to do with the embracing of assigned hierarchies, whether they're of race or gender or nationality, a belief in inequality, a interest in cultural homogeneity, whether of, again, race or nationality or religion, a marking of internal as well as external enemies, an embrace of political violence as a way of achieving or securing power, and the use of expulsion as a way of patrolling the borders of communities and societies. And one thing that's really important, the will of the community as kind of overriding the rule of law. And of course, community is a very vague idea, and community is constantly being redefined, whether on a very local basis or even on a national basis. And I think it's something that is both a continuity and something that manifests itself, rather differently. So that's kind of how, and I thought that the book begins actually. Yeah, at first, some of you may know of Louis Hartz's book published in the 1950s called The Liberal Tradition in America. It was a very influential one, and argued, for kind of a consensus version of American history as basically being dominated by political and economic liberalism. And I thought very cleverly I would write a book about the illiberal tradition in America. But pretty quickly I learned that that was probably not the best approach, including when I made a presentation on Zoom to the other fellows and got some interesting suggestions from them. So I decided I would try to. The book starts with a chapter called The Invention of the Liberal Tradition in the 1940s and 1950s, and then goes back into the 17th century.
Just to push you a little more on what liberals and liberalism is, there are a lot of other labels that we use when we think about people who are on the right, whether you're talking conservatives, far right, fascists, even populist, and a phrase that I bet you
certainly
like me, I'm very uncomfortable with, because we know that in the 19th century there was a strong populist movement that was not illiberal, but fairly progressive. But it also seems to me that there are some contradictions in terms of how we distinguish liberals and illiberals. For example, I was thinking a lot of illiberals, or people that you would call that, believed in free speech and would defend it.
For themselves.
Both liberals and illiberals often had a very individualist approach to what makes change in history. Traditionally, both liberals and illiberals have been, I would say, blind to how economic and social inequality impedes freedom. And when thinking this, I was reminded of this great quote from this French journalist, Anatole France, that some of you may have heard of, who said, I'm not sure I have every word right, he said that the law in its majesty forbids rich and poor alike to sleep under the bridges. So, especially, and furthermore, just let me add one more thing, and then get you. And that is that liberal has often been used as a pejorative, not only by the right, but on the left.
Oh, definitely by the left.
So, talk about how they differ or what.
What I try to do, and as Linda suggested, it's not uncomplicated, is to recognize an idea concept that predated liberalism, that really developed out, especially in Europe, of feudal and early modern societies that didn't necessarily have anything to do with liberalism that eventually developed alongside of it, and then over time developed in relationship to it, powerfully enough so that I think liberalism itself and people who regard themselves as liberal kind of get entangled by it. What I was really trying to do, in part, was offer a view of U.S. history that decentered liberalism, that didn't deny that it was important, that didn't try to make an argument that illiberal, sensibilities or movements or, forms of organization were more important or less important, but that it would be, I think, more valuable for us to understand American history as involving multiple political currents, some of which had to do with liberalism and liberalism, some of which did not or did the best they could to escape from it. Both illiberalism and liberalism are, to some extent, ideal types. And that's always problematic for historians because, it's not as problematic for some social scientists, but ideal types don't necessarily work very well when you get on the ground. And this book, it's not an intellectual history. It's kind of a social history of ideas. It's how this stuff plays out in particular historical contexts, how it's embraced and rejected and changed. I do think that in both cases, people who study liberalism recognize, I use it in a political way rather than in an economic way, but they're obviously interconnected. There's lots of debate over when liberalism actually emerges and what it is. Is this a 17th century phenomenon? Is it a product of the French Revolution? And whether, say, it's 20th century versions of modern liberalism, sometimes called corporate liberalism, what its, relationship is to liberalism itself. But I try to, think about it in terms of a number of characteristics, which is, the idea of widespread, if not universal, rights-bearing, the idea of democratic political practice, the idea that society should be organized by representative institution, the idea of at least legal equality, meaning equality before the law. And, in many respects, illiberalism is a rejection of all of that. It's not necessarily a conscious rejection from the beginning because that's how the societies were organized. And one of the things I think that's, interested me is that, at certain times, small-scale movements or attitudes that have long been associated, say, with early democratic aspects or somehow the predecessors of, a liberal democracy in the future actually turned out to be very different on the ground. And just to get to your point, that, say, for example, people who oppose the ratification of the Constitution, called anti-federalists, it was kind of an epithet. And one of the things they were interested in was they were, interested in securing local control. But local control also meant, sometimes they were opposed to coastal elites, and sometimes they were opposed to what they thought was a new political system that would be distant from them, that would be too centralized, and so on. And so they seemed to be kind of pushing back in a democratic way, and to some extent they are. But what they were interested in doing was kind of securing the relationships of power and hierarchy that prevailed in their communities, and of patrolling the borders of their communities against those who were regarded as outsiders. Illiberalism, is tied up with suspicions of people who are not like them, their insistence on patrolling both potentially internal troublemakers as well as and using expulsion. Expelling people from Puritan, towns in the 17th century up through, the 19th century, where there were lots of expulsions, are part of the kind of content of this, not to mention, hostility to native peoples and the determination to rid their territories of them. So I guess, again, it's sort of the idea of illiberalism, unlike simply, particular forms Conservatism, later on, Fascism, gives you a sense that there is a lot of it, and it can change very quickly. So that, this is a book that does try to emphasize, political volatility, and it's volatility among social groups, it's volatility among individuals. People do not fit, very clearly into a box, although certain social groups tend to, end up in something of a box. But it does, I think, alert us to the kind of things that bind groups of people together and also involve the exclusion of others. I mean, I think that the exclusion is really oftentimes at the heart of, what I think of as illiberalism.
Yeah. Following on this, and I guess I have to talk both about liberal and illiberal, would you ever have conceived of illiberalism as a social movement?
Now I do.
And that the word populism arises because of that it is designed to label a conservative perspective or a far-right perspective that is rooted in large-scale social activism from people at the bottom, so to speak. And by contrast, for example, I was thinking about voter suppression. Well, there was a very strong liberal, not a movement, but certainly a force pushing for voter suppression on the grounds that only people who had the appropriate knowledge and moral standing should be entitled to the franchise. And, right. I'm sure and probably most people know that the Southern victory in depriving Black people of a right to vote was often rested on exactly those kind of claims, that these people cannot be full citizens of a liberal. Right. Of a liberal
one of the things, I think it's good that you brought that up. One of the things I got really interested in when thinking about how illiberalism sort of transforms itself or is transformed, looks precisely at this period. When I looked at progressivism, sort of the period between roughly 1900 and 1920, which is generally seen as part of the birth of modern liberalism. What struck me about it was the, almost across the progressive spectrum, and that spectrum was pretty considerable. Nonetheless, there seemed to be an interest in what you might call social engineering. There was an interest in eugenics, which, if you read the literature on progressivism, it's generally treated as a sidebar. And yet, wherever you look, there's an incredible buy-in that really gets back to Linda's point, because what happens during the progressive period is not simply the most extreme version, which is the advent of Jim Crow, political disfranchisement of Black people, segregation, even harsher labor regimes, but the attempt to redefine political participation. Herbert Crowley is a really good example of this, who was
privilege.
Yeah, who was very influential with, Teddy Roosevelt and his new nationalism, who basically thought that, politics ought to be the sphere of educated experts. It should be bureaucratized. That, he was very, very tough on what he called Jeffersonian democracy, which was more local political participation, which from his point of view tended toward corruption. And therefore, the idea of marginalizing people who were, not regarded as capable of exercising a franchise and participating in politics at the level that he thought, who understood, as he would put it, the national purpose. This is proto-fascist. I think that it's not, if you think of what's going on in this period between eugenics, other forms of social engineering, scientific management, which is really taking hold in this period. You think about American imperialism. You think about, the sort of the nationalization of racism in new ways, where the Supreme Court and the federal government is giving its imprimatur. I mean, this anticipates, what's going to happen in Europe in the 1920s, and not to mention, as Linda knows better than me, what happens in the United States in the 1920s. So, I try to make a case that, this is a period where that's not all that's going on. And where Linda grew up in Portland, Oregon, there were really interesting movements that included trying to make occupation the basis of political apportionment. I mean, that's still ahead of our time. So they are not the only currents, but I think that in a sense, progressivism was kind of a movement that operated at numerous levels. I mean, it was a corporate movement in part. It was a movement of people who were trying to redefine the nature of politics, who were embracing new hierarchies. I mean, Teddy Roosevelt talked a lot about, the problem of enfeebled people, basically weighing down the capacities of the population in general. So, it helps us understand that what we're looking at now is the end of a long period when voter turnout and political participation was, it's over a century of decline. And I think that's important.
I want to push a little bit on something you hinted at by using a different word, which is expertise. And you write, and American historians know well, that in the progressive era, there was a lot of a move to the idea of that you do research and you present this research, and that is the basis of policy. Louis Brandeis, the Supreme Court Justice, was noted for bringing, quote unquote, scientific expertise into the court to affect decisions. Now, a lot of that was fine and good. Although I have to say, well, let me just give a couple of examples from my work that has led me to some suspicion about expertise. For example, in the early 20th century, hard rock miners in the West began becoming ill. They were becoming ill with what today is called pulmonary thrombosis. That was not the word then. The mine managers believed that they became ill because they had poor hygiene at home. And they organized ways of trying to educate people, particularly the wives of miners, about the way to raise children and to do this and that. Well, the miners knew that that was not the case. The miners knew what was making them sick. And finally, quite a really remarkable feminist progressive activist, Alice Hamilton, who was one of the founders of the modern public health, she went to these mines and she looked and she saw that it was the dust from the rocks that they were drilling into that was making them sick. There's a more contemporary example that came from a more recent work of mine. It had to do with farm workers and pesticides. Farm workers were really aware of very deleterious effects from the widespread spraying of aerosol pesticides. Again, we had a long period in this country, some of you may remember it, of being assured that these things were safe, these things like DDT and so on. Well, of course, it turned out that the mine workers were absolutely right. But once you start talking about expertise, it's very difficult to find ways that kind of vernacular expertise can enter the public discourse and deserve respect. And I'll just say one more thing. I once had an occasion to be talking to a very liberal, important politician who was concerned with the economy, and he literally said to me that the problem with our government is that we don't have enough smart people in the government. If we had smart people, we wouldn't have these problems. I think of that as related, and so I just,
Yeah.
I mean, what can I say?
Well, I think the idea of, vernacular expertise is an important one to point out because indeed we think about expertise in certain terms, about being formally educated and therefore, and by extension, look down upon communities that have managed themselves for a long time, whether it's medical or otherwise, based on, the expertise that they have developed as communities. And, one of the things we, have to recognize, too, with the pushback that we saw during COVID is a deep hostility toward, the expertise of the medical profession, which oftentimes, treated, groups of people with condescension or were dismissive of them. And the suspicion is very, very deep. There are obviously other things at play, but I certainly the idea that expertise or meritocracy reigns, and we see this now again resurfacing in opposition to, say, affirmative action, that we need to go back to a more meritocratic system, one that is very historically blind. Nonetheless, I think plays very well to a lot of audiences and does suggest the way in which people who regard themselves as, brandishing liberal credentials, in fact, find themselves slipping back when, they need to reestablish order, and they don't necessarily recognize power very well, and I think Linda alluded to some of this. That's true on both the left and the right.
Yeah. At one point in the book, you used the phrase modernizing liberalism.
Yeah.
And at least I see that in part as moving away or expanding a traditional notice of personal freedom, which actually for a long time meant freedom from government impositions on you, right? And in modernizing liberalism, I know we're all talking about increasingly the possible use of government to increase freedom at a certain level, if you mean by freedom, people's real ability to function freely in the world. But here again, I see a contradiction because I think that liberals and illiberals can often end up at the same place. I'm thinking recently about a lot of very, very needed, valid criticism of policing and police behavior. At the same time, I have been aware from things I've read that there, at least in New York City, there are a lot of people who live in the projects. I'm thinking people who are particularly of women, I'm particularly poor women, women of color. They want more policing because they feel that they are being left at the mercy of a certain kind of gang behavior. Again, consider abortion and the liberal tradition of privacy and individual rights. But what you have among people, and I'm not sure you could call them illiberal, is the notion that abortion is a form of killing, and you don't have the right to do that. And furthermore, in needing an abortion, you need an expert. You need, you don't actually need a doctor. For many, many, many centuries, plenty of people did abortions quite safely without that. But so this whole tension between freedom as a kind of negative freedom, what we won't allow government to do, and what we want government to do. And you actually mentioned a really good example of the illiberal approach to this when you mentioned Waldo Frank, who called the program called the NRA as part of the New Deal, part of Roosevelt's program. He wanted to call it fascism. Okay? So
this wasn't the National Rifle Association.
No, not the National Recovery Association.
Yeah. I think one of the features of illiberalism and how it changes has to do with its perspective on the state. and whether governments at national or local levels are seen as basically supporting the desires of various communities or standing opposed. I mean, you know, Linda's great book on the Klan in the 1920s, you talk about a right-wing movement. You know, it was the biggest political movement of that period, maybe one of the biggest right-wing movements ever in American history, stronger outside the South than in the South, motivated by anti-Catholicism and anti-Semitism, as well as anti-racism, that managed to get into power at, you know, from the ground all the way up to the Supreme Court. And I think that one of the things, you know, in the 1920s, I think there was this sense that the state, as it was in the service of people who were, you know, concerned about a lot of the changes taking place, concerned at that point. You know, remember 1924 is the first National Immigration Act, which sets quotas and particularly sets very high restrictions against immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, who were described as the Chinese of Europe, meaning culturally and socially and politically unassimilable. And
I'll just add one little piece of data to that. In those quotas, the quota for all of Africa, North and South, was 100.
And that doesn't change till 1965, with all sorts of consequences along the way. You know, clearly one of the things that has transformed in recent times, and which is why the far right sees 1965 as a tipping point, sees, of course, the 14th Amendment as a tipping point, and understands the government as collecting various client populations that does not include them. So from their point of view, there's kind of an anti-government disposition that might not have been, you know, there earlier. So it is part of the, you know, process of, you know, how these forms of illiberalism change, but, you know, they maintain some of the characteristics over time as well.
Looking back to my notion about what's a social movement, I think it's pretty obvious to all of us living today that what we might call illiberalism is in large part a social movement. But I just have one quick question about that. Is there ever a time when you think of liberalism as a social movement?
I think, I think there were important liberal social movements. I mean, you think about abolitionism. You think about various rights struggles. I mean, I don't regard populism necessarily as a liberal movement, but it certainly, you know, was a movement that both critiqued the concentration of wealth and power in the United States, that was trying to offer actually a program, unlike today's populists, who are not interested, you know, is simply interested in you know, in kind of defining elites as more people like us as the enemies, but have no critique of the way in which the inequalities of wealth and power are organized or any particular program for changing that. Certainly the civil rights movement, you know, its successes organized itself around its attachment to the Reconstruction amendments and to ideas. I mean, one of the things that's certainly the case is that whatever happened to the kind of principles that were laid down in the Declaration of Independence, the people who have embraced them most fully over time have been those who have been denied them, those who are on the outside. I mean, they're the ones who, you know, sort of embraced equality and democracy most fully. Whether they were involved in more particularist movements for, you know, around, say, black nationalism as a case in point, or, you know, they never talked about denying anybody their rights. They talked about expanding rights more generally. So to that extent, not all these movements are liberal in the sense that the combination of political and economic critique and programs might be social democratic, they might be democratic socialist. You know, socialism at the very time of progressivism had a really interesting history. And for the first, say, 15 years of the 20th century, the Socialist Party, we think about Eugene Debs, but in fact, the Socialist Party was organized on the local level across the country, elected people to local and state office. And where? Well, in Louisiana and Texas, Kansas and Oklahoma, the Dakotas. And one of the interesting historical questions that I guess Thomas Frank tried to take up, which is how did the red states become the red states, right? And how you take a political context of people looking left and things turn around. Now, obviously, they're not the same people, but nonetheless, there's a question of why the kind of political memories and political legacies changed, in such powerful ways.
Yeah, we don't have a lot of time left, but I do want to ask you about where neoliberalism fits in. Because, many people would consider neoliberalism to be illiberal. You just tell me what you think.
Well,
How would you place that on a spectrum?
Well, I have a chapter in the book called Neoliberals and Illiberalism. To some, it starts with Clinton's signing of the crime bill. Part of the war on drugs and war on crime that was, crucial to the development of mass incarceration. And one of the things that's really the case is that while neoliberals were interested in getting the state out of a regulatory function, they were very happy to get the state in to protect the relationships of the marketplace. And they also, not necessarily Clinton per se, but they also were very suspicious of democracy. They had serious doubts about whether democratic practices had any chance of realizing the kind of world and relationship of power that they were after. Milton Friedman went traveling down to talk to Pinochet shortly after the coup that destroyed the Allende regime. There's a lot of other examples where basically neoliberals don't see any problem in embracing what are clearly illiberal political dispositions. And I might also add that I kind of include, the advent of IT and the internet and the obsession of, people who have been central to it as if they didn't actually depend on the federal government for financial support ever since World War II, that somehow or other they are, these individualist champions. And yet, for all that the internet does, it's an incredible source of surveillance and person exploitation. I mean, we are being harvested all the time in ways we do not know. And, then our information, ourselves are being sold elsewhere. I mean, it's, and AI is obviously accentuating this, but this is, if you want to talk about a totalitarian vision, I think this is it.
Someone here raises a really interesting question about the relationship between illiberalism and anti-intellectualism. Do you think that these terms are in some way equivalent or not?
That is a great question because, Richard Hofstadter, who on the one hand was really central to advancing the idea of the liberal tradition in America, was also interested in all sorts of examples of illiberalism. He wrote, a book called Anti-intellectualism in American Life, where he, took examples over time, mostly more recent ones, and also was writing about the advent of the political right in the late 1940s and 1950s. Anti-intellectualism of some sorts does, coincide with and overlap with, illiberalism, depending on exactly what it is. I mean, there can be forms of so-called anti-intellectualism that are really pushbacks against expertise and the, sort of relationships of intellectual power that they represent. But nonetheless, if you read Hofstadter, he was certainly interested in what we would associate. I mean, he was interested in the rise of the radical right. He was interested, he kind of excoriated populism of the late 19th century for its negative features, being backward-looking, xenophobic, anti-Semitic, which were aspects of the movement, but tended to be, sort of relatively marginal. So I do think that, I would certainly encourage anyone to read Hofstadter's book, but also to recognize that anti-intellectualism is kind of a large and potentially vague term.
Yeah, I know, one other question is, can both liberals and illiberals be anti-intellectual? But I want to just push you on one thing that you mentioned, but actually I'd like you to address more directly, and that is the relationship between what we would call mainstream conservatism and illiberalism. Mm-hmm. I couldn't help but mention a wonderful phrase from my former wonderful colleague, Marilyn Young, who, I can't remember if she said it or wrote it, but she asked, where is the ruling class now that we need them? The point being, in both a Marxist and a liberal understanding, the ruling class is supposed to have a long view. They're supposed to be concerned with the overall stability of the political order and the society. That seems to me quite different from illiberalism.
Well, I do think that illiberalism overlaps with certainly reactionary conservatism, which is based on a notion of inherent inequalities. I don't think necessarily conservatism in general has freed itself from that. Some conservatives are conservatives in some ways, but not in other ways. There are people who are, economic conservatives, but are not necessarily conservatives on social terms. One of the things that just struck me as I was doing this, and I guess I hadn't quite, grasped it, is that if you look at the course of American history, the really unusual moments are when liberals and the left are actually ruling. Are actually in power. Because for the most part, they're not. And for the most part, if you talk about, defeats, who gets crushed, it's all, I don't know of an example other than the Civil War, when a reactionary class was crushed. Although they had very good surviving powers. And I can't think of other examples. There are examples when conservatives and illiberals fall out of power to some extent, but are certainly not, they're not defeated. And I think one of the things we need to understand in terms of what we're up against is that. And they've always had a pretty substantial social base and always enormous resources, economic resources to support them.
Here's a really provocative question in a good way. Is the policing of private spaces like universities and social media that are private institutions that effectively serve as public forums, is that an example of illiberalism?
Well, it can be. Various institutions have certain obligations to protect people who are involved in them and participate in them from threats or harassment or violence. And so there are certain kinds, I think, of policing against, harm that can come to people. But, that can, expand out or, become, a phenomenon that is much more restrictive. That is, look, we're dealing with a time where universities are really under fire on a lot of fronts, and in some ways from rich donors who in the past, just wanted to slap their names on a building, and now seem to think that they should determine what's in the curriculum. Not in physics or chemistry, but mostly in, the humanities and some of the social sciences. I mean, this is a new kind of policing that is taking place. Obviously, there are issues about, codes of conduct, which, can be extremely important to establish a groundwork for people to interact and to challenge each other. But at the same time, in the 1990s, there was a case at the University of Pennsylvania of harassment of black women on campus. And the president at the time, Sheldon Hackney, established some kind of behavioral code. And of course, the right wing now, which is calling for a lot of them, thought that this was absolutely outrageous. But I do think that, policing is a strong and powerful word. Sometimes it evokes its own forms of harassment and exclusion. But I think that institutions, as in our society, has to establish certain kind of rules, as we do, for conduct, so that people don't feel threatened or harmed.
Liberals are often condemning a kind of political action that is deliberately disruptive, interrupting speakers, blocking roads, sitting in. Can't we call that illiberal?
Well, liberals would call it that. I teach a course at NYU called American History Makers You Probably Never Heard Of. And the first one we study is a man named Benjamin Lay. Now, Benjamin Lay was a very, very radical Quaker in the early 18th century. He was really apoplectic about the way in which the Quaker community, both in England and then in the United States, participated in the slave trade and slavery. And he used to bust into meetings and disrupt them. At one point, he would carry in a bladder filled with red liquid and break it. And he was run out of one, Quaker meeting house after another. And he ended up in the United States in part because of that. And then you think about, I would ask some of the students thought, well, don't you think he would have done better if he, had more less disruptive methods? And then you think, well, how do you challenge the established systems of power, even within your own community? There's no question that, social movements that have as their goals the expansion of rights, ideas about social justice, nevertheless, need to be forceful and need to engage in civil disobedience and perhaps other struggles, because power, as Frederick Douglass put it, power doesn't give up on its own. I mean, no struggle, no progress. So I don't think, I think it would take things out of a historical context to just try to isolate certain behaviors and then try to decide, whether they are liberal, illiberal, or whatever you want to call them, rather than understanding the larger frame in which they're taking place.
This is a more directly political and personal question. Someone asked, how different would your book be if you had written it before 2016?
Well, I probably wouldn't have. Well, I don't know. I don't think it would be any different, to tell you the truth. The question is whether I would have been interested in writing it. I had finished some projects. I mean, you know how this thing goes, and you're kind of looking for something else to do. This kind of jumped up, and I thought, I don't know. I mean, this could be interesting to work on. I do not think that that this book effectively would have been any different before Trump, because a lot of the things I end up talking about, I mean, the book ends with a chapter called Specters of Race, War, and Replacement. And a lot of it is about what happened before Trump. Trump kind of just is there at the very end. And that's the important thing. I think we need to understand that, and this is about the kind of violation of liberal norms and so on, there's this idea that it's all about him. And that somehow or other, if he is removed from, I mean, look, it wouldn't be bad, but if he was removed, that somehow or other we would solve the problem. Like what he did was he managed, impressively to tap into the fears and concerns and, he validated people's way of thinking about the world and offered a pretty simplistic set of answers. And if it wasn't him, it would have been someone else, maybe not as gross, but in some ways we were lucky so far because all he cared about was himself and money. So at that point, he didn't build a movement. Now he surrounded himself with people who really want to do that, and which is why a second term would be so frightening.
Well, I can't avoid going from there to the question of the word fascism. Mm-hmm. I noticed that you get around it by talking about fascist pulses. Mm-hmm. I've gotten around it by using it as an adjective, fascistic, because there is, do you think there's any value in any use of that term to discuss what's going on, not just in the U.S., but in the world?
Well, I do have a chapter called Fascist Pulses, which is on the 1920s, and which I think, that's exactly what is going on, not to mention the admiration of fascist regimes, the support that the United States and various organizations gave to people who, were involved in eugenic research. Mussolini was widely admired really until 1935 when he invaded Ethiopia. Hitler and FDR got into power basically at the same time. And briefly, FDR thought about maybe there should be some kind of meeting. That didn't turn out. I do think that one of the advantages of thinking about illiberalism is that fascism is a form of illiberalism, but it's a historically specific form of illiberalism. And I think as a political slogan, fascism is terrific. It evokes the kind of concerns that people should have. It's about repression, it's about exclusion, it's about forms of domination, surveillance, expulsions, and so on and so forth. Fascism, there were different forms of fascism in the 1920s and 1930s. Some of them endured in places like Spain and Portugal. They certainly there were quasi-fascist regimes in other parts of the country, Latin America as well. But I think, as historians, we need to be a little careful about what invoking that means. And I don't object per se, because I think an argument can be made. Are we moving we're clearly in a very illiberal moment. There's no doubt about that, and it's part of a larger moment of reckoning that's taking place, and I think, has a lot to do with the end of the Cold War and things that happened as a result of that. But I've read people who made interesting cases why we should, but I do think that it tends to see kind of history repeating itself in ways that are not necessarily all that useful to us, that recognize, that we need to recognize the historical specificity of the kind of movements and objectives that are happening now. And if they bear resemblance to fascist regimes, that's important to recognize, but we don't necessarily need to pull out fascism as a kind of rubric under which we're going to try to stick everything else. I think illiberalism, whatever the problems with liberalism, kind of works a little better.
Well, I've been told we need to stop. I just want to say, read this book. I've been a historian for a long time, and it made me see things somewhat differently. And it's a great read.
Well, thank you. And
So-
I'd also like, it's a great honor to share a stage with Linda Gordon. And thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. You can buy 3 books if you want.
Reception.
Right.
Some
I guess I should go out there.
refreshments for people.
I think the refreshments are in there, but I think I have to go out there in case.
You are so great at doing this.
You were
You
great.
can speak off the cuff.